Welcome to the UN and Organised Crime, a podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Ian Tennant. In this episode, we are exploring how the UN system integrates gender equality and gender sensitivity into its responses to organised crime. At the high level, the UN's commitment to gender equality is rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there are various other UN instruments and processes which emphasise, for example, the status of women in society, the role of women in conflict prevention, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction. But when it comes to transnational organised crime and gender, the complex dynamics are often underexplored, and discussion in consensus-based UN fora can be contested and simplistic. In the outside world, in both national policies and international programming, gender-sensitive understanding of and responses to organised crime have gained increasing international attention and support. Although there is of course still a long way to go. But when diplomats representing countries who support these gender-based approaches try to connect the dots at the UN, they can face backlash from delegations who don't see things the same way, especially in consensus-based settings such as Vienna. Ahead of the 12th session of the Conference of Parties to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, taking place in October in Vienna, this episode will discuss the evolving nature of gender discussions in the multilateral space, the need to include women's and diverse gender perspectives in the international policy space, as well as challenges faced by female diplomats working on organised crime issues. Gender equality, women's and minority empowerment, and gender-sensitive policies are all vital building blocks for a more inclusive strategy against organised crime, something which the UK government supports through both its policies and programmes and through its engagement at the UN. And I'm delighted to be discussing these issues with the UK Ambassador Corinne Kitsell today. Ambassador Kitsell currently serves as the UK's permanent representative to various international organisations here in Vienna, having previously served in multilateral postings in Geneva and New York, as well as having been head of the FCDO UN and Multilateral Department in London, along with having served in several other posts around the world. Ambassador Kitsell, thank you for joining us today. Ambassador, you have been a strong advocate for inclusion of gender perspectives in your work as a diplomat at the UN in New York, Geneva, and now here as Ambassador in Vienna, where you were one of the first chairs of the informal UNODC Group of Friends for Gender Equality. How have you seen gender discussions evolve, and what are the current challenges for diplomats promoting gender in multilateral spaces?
Well, thanks, Ian, and let me just start by thanking you for inviting me to join you for this podcast today. I mean, I started my career in the 1990s, and I think that was probably the golden age of multilateralism, although I guess we didn't realise it at the time. You know, after the end of the Cold War, there were a lot of things that were agreed in the UN system that I think we would struggle to agree now. And gender negotiations and work on gender featured really early on in my career, actually. Going way back to Beijing in 1995, the iconic UN Women's Conference. And I was very, very junior as part of the UK delegation to that. But it was a really inspiring experience. And actually, at that point, probably one of the only times where I found myself in an environment where most of the members of most of the delegations were women. And actually, that didn't happen much in those days. In the early days of my career, frankly, most diplomats, and certainly most senior diplomats, were men. But sort of fast forward a bit, and I guess it's worth remembering that the Sustainable Development Goals agreed by member states that by 2030 we should be achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. And that's not so many years ago that member states agreed that, but I find it really shocking that here we are now in 2024 and we're still having the conversation even about gender, and there are still countries that argue against gender equality and even worse, arguing against considering whether and how issues and policies impact on different women and girls. And it's surprising to me now, even though there are many female ambassadors, that we're frankly even still having this conversation.
So you spoke about that golden age of multilateralism and the prominence of female diplomats in those negotiating teams. It sounds almost like there was a definite direction of travel that everybody in those negotiations was generally working towards. Is that how you would characterize it? And how does that compare to, what you've just described as the more recent atmosphere? Is there a sense that not only is there inertia, but sometimes it feels like moving backwards?
Yes, I think maybe because I was very junior, perhaps I wasn't aware of some of the challenges at the time, but it felt like an optimistic time in the 1990s. And what we definitely see now across the UN system, so across all the Vienna-based organizations, this isn't just an issue for transnational organized crime, is a small group of countries who are working very hard to roll back language on gender equality. And here in Vienna, it's been particularly led by Iran and the Russians, and they argue against language on gender equality. They would rather we didn't mention gender. And it's a very strange experience as a female ambassador to be sat in a negotiation with, frankly, male ambassadors from those countries who are arguing against gender equality in a meeting where here in Vienna, my French, my American, and many other oppos are actually female as well. But it's galvanized us, I think, as member states here to get more organized. And you mentioned the group of friends on gender equality that the UK and our Colombian colleagues set up jointly back in 2021, I think that was. And that was because we realized that perhaps we were being too complacent, that we thought we'd won these battles. We thought we'd won these battles 20 or 30 years ago, and clearly we haven't. So we needed to get organized and essentially continue the fight.
For those listeners who are maybe not quite familiar with some of the UN terminology, can you describe very briefly what a group of friends does, who's in the group, and what kind of activities do those ambassadors and diplomats carry out together?
That's a good question. There are many groups of friends across the UN system on all sorts of topics, thematic topics, geographical topics. In this case, so the group of friends is a voluntary grouping of member states. And so in this case, countries that are interested in promoting gender equality, some countries that actually have particular focus on gender in their foreign policies. And it's totally voluntary. And we pulled this group together here in Vienna. Actually, it was principally because we were fighting these battles in negotiations where we were negotiating text in resolutions or declarations or other official documentation in the UN ODC space. And we realized that we needed to be better coordinated in terms of agreeing amongst ourselves what we actually were trying to achieve and then how we were going to go about that tactically. So the group was formed for very practical reasons in this case. We do also have an active international gender champions network here in Vienna, which again, many ambassadors, but also heads of the Vienna-based organizations are members of. And that's perhaps more of a forum for talking about gender issues more broadly and talking about things that we do in our own teams to promote gender equality or things that happen in our own foreign policy. The group of friends was an effort to do something really practical. And we're very proud of it because it has actually had an impact. And one of the things that I think I'm particularly proud of is how we encouraged some of the smaller countries, those who perhaps don't often have a loud voice in negotiations, to actually speak up more confidently and talk about the importance that they place on gender equality. And this isn't by any means a group of Western countries either. It includes countries from all the geographical regions, which is great to see.
I mean, we've spoken a bit about how, the makeup of delegations, you can still have arguments about gender with male ambassadors. When it comes to organized crime is also one of those spheres that's seen as historically been seen as a man's space, whether it's the mafia, organized crime groups, or whether it's in the law enforcement response. Obviously, that's changing from both perspectives. But why does the UK government think it's important to ensure that the experiences of different genders are considered in efforts to prevent and combat organized crime?
That's a great question. And I think I think you're absolutely right that when we think about things like human trafficking, drug trafficking, money laundering, whatever kind of transnational organized crime we might be considering, we all have biases and stereotypes, maybe which we don't even realize. And clearly, if there are key decision makers, the policy makers who also have those biases, then the policies that they're designing won't be fair. And so, first of all, there's this sort of point that when we're thinking about organized crime, as you say, there's a sort of bit of a stereotype that men are perhaps more likely to be seen as the perpetrators and women are as the victims. But that's just, it's a stereotype. And one of the things that the UK has been really keen on is actually finding out what's really going on and ensuring that we have the data that actually supports some of this. So to avoid that really simplistic view and ensure that the policies that are designed actually work and actually address entire communities. And that's not to say that gender mainstreaming in this context is sort of all about women's issues. It's actually genuinely about ensuring that we have policies and programs that are designed to take account of gender issues, both for women and girls and men and boys.
Yeah, I think there's a new and emerging data and evidence all the time on, not only who are the perpetrators and how to understand the dynamics of organized crime groups, including when women are involved, but also the different needs that male and female victims have. And I think this is especially important as we run up to the Conference of Parties to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, taking place around a month from now in October. Why do you think that this is a relevant moment, this 12th Conference of Parties, to raise awareness of the importance of gender mainstreaming?
Well, I think an important starting point is that the UNTOC Conference of Parties only meets once every 2 years. So it's an opportunity to reflect on how the world has changed in that time and how organised crime has evolved, and to renew our energy collectively as a global community to ensure that gender equality is high up on the agenda of issues. And if we as member states don't address this issue now, then obviously we're just essentially creating more trouble for ourselves further down the line. But I think there have been positive changes in the last 2 years, and we'd also want to reflect on those at the UNTOC COP and have the opportunity to celebrate some success. I mean, for example, it was only last year in December that we had the first resolution on the importance of gender issues in tackling corruption. And that resolution was tabled by Ghana, which, shows that this is, again, as I say, it's not a Western issue. It's something that Ghana's support across the geographical regions.
Yes, no, it's been actually striking as well, seeing who's engaged in the gender debate. It's one of those things, I think, that brings different parts of the multipolar space together. And you see various different countries involved, as you say, not just Western countries. I think one of the other ways in which we ensure these gender perspectives are brought into processes like the UNTOC conference is through ensuring that civil society perspectives are integrated into the conference. I mean, from your perspective, you've served in New York, Geneva, and also here in Vienna. How do you see the space for civil society engagement in Vienna, and how do you think it could be improved, and what priorities does the UK have to make sure that the space is open?
That's a great question, and I think we absolutely can't underestimate the impact and importance of civil society across negotiations, across the whole of the UN system. I actually think it's rather smug of member states or of governments to think that you can have government representatives in a room who can design policies and make decisions, and that we actually have all the answers and that we have all the information, without going out and engaging with those who are on the ground actually doing the work. And for us, the importance of having, for the UK delegation, having members of civil society actually as part of our delegation, bringing in genuine, some of it's anecdotal, some of it's genuine, like data-led, but bringing in real evidence of what actually works on the ground. I mean, there's a sort of phrase that sometimes gets used, sort of nothing about us without us. And the idea that you could have policymakers talking about what might work on the ground in local communities without actually including those local communities in the conversation just seems kind of crazy to me. But of course, we understand that there are certain governments who feel, for whatever reason, that having those representatives present and having them fully involved in the conversation is somehow inappropriate. And these are things that only governments can decide. I mean, we seek to support civil society to be part of our delegation. We've supported civil society from other countries to be part of delegations for other countries, particularly, of course, in some cases, coming to these meetings in places like Vienna or indeed Geneva or New York is an expensive business. And so we devote resources to ensuring that delegations can be as inclusive as possible.
I think those of us from civil society are always grateful to governments like the UK, and I know the UK has been active in the group of friends of multi-stakeholder participation as well, in making sure that the space is open, whether that's through delegations or through the general procedures for applying to these meetings. Without sounding like a 1950s kind of presidential interview, is there anything else you would like to add at this at this point before we finish?
Well, it might just be worth sort of saying that for us, this goes beyond just talking in generalities about gender equality. And I think the particularly important point on transnational organised crime has been investing in producing the Serious Organised Crime Toolkit, where the UK has provided funding to UNODC to design a toolkit which has then been rolled out across the world. And we've co-funded with Canada a toolkit on gender and human rights. And what does that actually mean? I mean, that just sounds like we've produced a document or something. But what it's about is being able to share tools with communities and with civil society on the ground that actually then promotes kind of practical approaches to ensuring gender sensitive and human rights compliant strategies against serious organised crime. And that toolkit's been rolled out across 7 regions around the world, and there have been thousands of participants in workshops. So it's sort of worth stressing that this is something for us which goes beyond just a point of principle and into trying to do something that actually has a practical impact globally.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for taking the time to join us here today on the podcast, and for all the work that you do and your team does to promote gender issues here at the UN, as you've just described. These are not easy discussions, and it's more impactful when civil society and states can work together to promote these universal values about which we're talking, which benefits not only women and girls, but society in general around the world. The UK Permanent Mission here in Vienna and the Global Initiative are working together on a range of activities in the context of the upcoming UNTOC conference, which will include a new briefing paper on the topic of gender and organised crime. There will also be plenty of opportunities for delegates attending the conference to share relevant experiences, for example, through the attendance of members of the Global Initiative's Resilience Fund, Women's Fellowship to Build Resilience to Environmental Crime, which is funded by the UK Foreign Office as well. So, you've been listening to the UN and Organised Crime, a podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thank you for listening.